All right, here we are. This is my first ever political history stream. Today we're going to be talking about something that I found really interesting. When Vosh went on the Hippy Dippy podcast, it's basically a political podcast where people talk about numerous other topics, but this specific debate that they were doing was about climate change and if it was real, how problematic it was, what we need to do to fix it, what we're going to look like in the future. And during the debate, Vosh brings up that the United States and the European Union should subsidize developing nations, i.e. China, India, Africa, Thailand, Asia, South America, because primarily the United States and Europe have had the advantage of over having 200 years of being able to industrially develop over time. I.e., we've been able to use coal, we've been able to use natural gas, we've been able to use oil, we've been able to use so many other advantages that have allowed us to industrialize compared to, let's say, India. India is still a developing country. All over their country, there are people that don't have industrialized products. They don't have a large manufacturing base as much as the United States did. We're kind of going away now, but that happens when you become a service economy, which is an entirely different topic I don't want to go into. But hey, let's go into what I really want to talk about. Is there really any politically and historically based analysis when it comes to subsidizing another nation to develop fossil fuels or develop an economy after it's been developing for over a course of time? And how are we going to get that country to go into green energy while skipping using coal, natural gas, etc.? And I'm primarily going to use the two historical topics that I know decently well. I'm not an expert in them. I haven't written a paper, but I've read a lot. So I think I can speak of the topics with pretty good knowledge. The two topics we're going to be talking about are the United States' occupation of Japan from 1945 to 1952. And we're going to be talking about Iraq and the United States' occupation of that. Now, why am I focusing on two war-torn states? Well, one, Japan came out of U.S. occupation, and by the 1980s had become the second strongest country by GDP, or the third. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. It basically came from an industrialized nation that was bombed to hell into one of the strongest economies that we've ever seen in the history of the world in about, give or take, 30 years. And then Iraq. And Iraq and Afghanistan, too, are seen as critical failures of the United States' occupation plan of building up those countries and bringing democracy. And my primary sources that I'm going to be using, at least to make it easier on you guys who are watching, is I'm primarily going to be focusing on a document released by Congress that explores where the aid's going between Japan, Iraq, and Germany during this period of occupation. So let me pull that up. So here's a little document. It's very short. You can look it up on Google. It's like one of the first results. It is basically called the U.S. Occupation Assistance, Iraq, Germany, and Japan Compared. It's released from 2006. So let's go into the context of Japan. What happened with Japan to make it such a successful economy? And what did the US do to make it or help with it becoming a successful economy after being pretty much destroyed after World War II. The biggest thing that makes a difference between Iraq and Japan is that Japan was able to industrialize. Japan industrialized from 1860 something to about 1900 in 40 years. And in that 40 years, they were able to go toe-to-toe with a European power, Russia, in the 1905 Russo-Japanese War. So they were already an industrialized power by the time World War II happened. I think that's pretty self-evident by the fact that they were a preeminent power on the Axis powers, so we're not going to go into too in-depth of their industrial capability. They were just industrialized. They were able to use coal, natural gas, etc. When US occupation happened at the end of 1945, what we ended up seeing is a country that basically had its entire economy destabilized, and its entire economy and government type were going to be completely changed. In the era of 1945, 1947, Japan went through with the three sister programs: demilitarization, democratization, and reintegration. These three tenets were to guide Douglas MacArthur, the leader of the security force, SCAP. I'm just going to call it SCAP. I can't name it off the top of my head. Long acronym. It's called SCAP. Supreme Allied Command of the Pacific. He was in charge of taking these three sisters programs and effectively changing Japan. The first was demilitarization, getting rid of the entirety of the Japanese Imperial Army, Imperial Navy, and their Air Force. Completely and utterly gone. That was the entire plan. So he did that. What was left with Japan was a police force. That's it. Just a police force. The United States would take control of defending Japan if somehow Russia decided to attack, which didn't obviously happen. Another thing is democratization, completely changing how the government type worked. At the time of pre-war Japan, Japan was controlled by one important faction, the militarists. These are Hideki Tojo's faction that took over parliament in the late 1920s, 30s, when the Great Depression happened. Before that, Japan was a pretty liberal democracy. They had a prime minister, they had liberal politicians, what we would call liberal politicians today, in control. So you have the militarists, they're gone. So you bring in the liberals, who under the militarists were the second powerful faction, but they really weren't powerful because the militarists turned it into a fascist dictatorship. Under the emperor, then the militarists, and then everybody else. So the liberals come back in. I believe the first prime minister under MacArthur was a man named Yoshida. He was a very prominent liberal leftist in Japan. And he, even though he was leftist against imperialism, etc., he noted that without the United States, Japan would not be able to reintegrate, bring their economy back, and make it a powerful nation again without the United States. So he heavily advocated for the United States to stay and occupy Japan, even though he was a liberal leftist, not a militarist, not imperialistic. Important factor there. And basically what ended up happening is in 1947, George Kennan, the US ambassador to the Soviet Union, basically said the Soviet Union is the preeminent threat to America and capitalism worldwide. And this caused the Cold War. Basically, the one thing that makes everybody scared of leftism now happened because George Kennan ended up sending that letter and a bunch of other stuff. It's just not George Kennan, but that's the easiest pinpoint of the first start of the Cold War. This basically changed the entirety of the Three Sisters program. Demilitarization became, we're going to remilitarize Japan. We're going to allow them to spend 1% of their GDP on their military. which at the time was pretty small. Remember that police force? It became the self-defense force, basically because of the Cold War. Democratization became, screw that, we're just going to make sure that capitalism comes in, and we're not going to care about liberalizing Japan entirely. And then reintegration. That was the second one that they kept. Reintegration into the capitalist world. And that is a lot of history to throw at you. I get that, but it's important to talk about that. Because by the Cold War, the United States, instead of trying to liberalize the entirety of Japan, they said, screw that, we're going to go back. And that's when you get all the war criminals and potential terrible people coming back into power. Because the United States needed to have a, what they would call at the time, a workshop of capitalism within Asia. That was going to be Japan. Because 1947, China was ripped into a civil war between the pro-capitalist KMT faction by Chiang Kai-shek and obviously Mao Zedong and the communists. And Chiang Kai-shek was getting his ass kicked. So China was off the table of ever working with the United States at that point. So Japan was the sole number one. So what did the United States do to make sure that Japan would not go to a communist leftist dictatorship or retreat from capitalism? Well, like Europe, they decided to do a Marshall Plan. It wasn't called the Marshall Plan, but it basically is the Marshall Plan for Japan. So, according to that PDF I brought up, the total U.S. assistance to Japan for 1946-1952 was roughly $15.2 billion in 2005 dollars, of which 77% was grants and 23% were loans. It is important to note the reason of this disparity between grants and loans is that, surprisingly, most of Japan's industrial base, while pretty much wrecked, a lot of it was salvageable. I can't say that word. Salvageable. We'll just go with that. Salvageable. Perfect. We'll go with that. And Japan still had an industrial base. They were still able to go about it. So the United States worked with the industrial power of Japan that was still working. That's where we get like Kawasaki, Mitsubishi, all of those. Can't name them off the top of my head. And essentially the United States poured money, grant money, straight into that, into the economy only. There were some military benefits going into that, but it was primarily grants and loans for industrial use. Mostly because the United States wanted to get Japan to a point where it could be self-sufficient and be the model society for all of Asia to look at, i.e. basically bringing the co-prosperity sphere back, except Japan was not going to literally go and rape all of Asia. So basically, what we have is the United States poured not a lot of money just into Japan. $15.1 billion today, that doesn't seem that much. That's like what? 1/10% of the entire amount of money we spend on the military today? Now, of course, we're talking about an industrialized nation. Japan also had, after occupation, a number of American ventures into it. That's why Japan has a lot of nuclear power plants within its borders, because of American businesses coming over in the 1950s and 60s going like, hey, we're not going to build them in America, but we'll build them here. And that's why Japan primarily uses a lot of nuclear energy, because one, they were an industrial base, and two, American business ventures came in and were like, hey, we'll build them. We'll make money this way. So let's get to Iraq, because Iraq is going to be the model that we have to look at in what not to do and what we're going to have to contend with when coming into developing countries. Now, the thing is the United States is not going to invade India to go, hey, you need green energy. Obviously, if that happened, I don't think anybody would accept green energy. I think instead they would view it as American imperialism. But anyway, we're not going to invade developing countries, but it's important to look at Iraq, because Iraq was not an industrialized country, was heavily sanctioned by the United States after the Gulf War, and even prior to the Gulf War, was still sanctioned because Saddam Hussein was still in charge. And Iraq, with any industrial capacity that it had, was destroyed with the Gulf War. Their WMDs were gone, etc. So what did the US do in order to basically try and bring Iraq to capitalist democracy? So the report says that, where is it? That the U.S. aid allocations, all grant assistance for Iraq appropriated from 2003 to 2006, totaled $28.9 billion. About $17.6 billion, 62% of that money, went for economic and political reconstruction assistance. The remaining $10.9 billion was targeted at bolstering Iraqi security. So, we go in and we try and subsidize other countries. What's the one thing we can take off that list? Political reconstruction and security. There's two that we can remove right there. Economic aid is the number one thing that we need to look at there. Obviously, the United States not going to invade these countries. I have to say that again. So, only about, let's say, all that $28.9 billion going into economic aid, what would that do for Iraq? Well, one, it would allow them to build solar power plants. It would allow them to build possibly nuclear power plants, but nuclear costs a lot of money. So probably solar, maybe wind. I don't know the wind index of Iraq, so I can't tell you. But we could bolster more money into these countries. We have the money. It doesn't cost a lot. For one, spending $15.1 billion to rebuild the Japanese economy to come back from complete devastation really is an important fact to look at. Sure, their economic issues were more played around losing the war than losing industrial capacity, but they lost industrial capacity. They still kept a lot of it, but they lost a lot as well. When we go into these developing countries, we need to understand they aren't industrialized. And how do we get them to be industrialized without polluting the entire world and eventually we all die? We support it with green energy. We go in and we go like, hey, we will give you $30 billion, Iraq, to build renewable energy, solar, wind, nuclear even. We go into India, we'll give you $100 billion to build solar, wind, nuclear power plants all day. We need to understand that developing countries don't have the same history as us. They're developing. America, Britain, France, Germany, we had over 200 years to exploit the natural resources of this land. And we had probably for 150 years of that, we had no idea global warming was happening. Around 1950, they were like, oh yeah, global warming's happening, but we can just ignore it. Who cares? Developing countries do not have the same history as us. They're developing, they don't have an industrialized base. They're going to use coal products, they're going to use oil, they're going to use natural gas to industrialize, unless the United States and Europeans come in and go, hey, we'll give you $100 billion, we'll give you $200 billion to effectively change the economies and gear them towards green energy. Because if we don't, these countries aren't going to give a shit that global warming is happening. They aren't. Let's be honest. They want to industrialize. They're trying to industrialize. The only way they know how, the only cheap way in those countries is with natural gas, oil, etc. Unless the United States comes in and goes, hey, we'll subsidize. Now, of course, we're going to get political benefactors going like, well, why should my tax money go to funding Iraqi people building nuclear power plants? We should worry about us. We should worry about us. I think Rosh gives a great analogy in the debate, talking about Evangelion, when before the second impact or after the second impact, I can't remember. I don't know in Evangelion, but everybody pours trillions of dollars into the single entity to build giant robots. The thing is if you really give a shit about America, if you really give a shit about Europe, if you give a shit about anywhere in the world, we need to understand that our money needs to go to not only building renewable energy in America, but building renewable energy in other countries. If we don't do it, we're screwed. And if we're going to play this political game of my tax dollars shouldn't be going to brown people, this is why you should not have a voice in politics. You're ignorant. And you need to understand that just because the US goes green doesn't mean that we're not fucked. We'll be fucked. US goes green, India's not going to go green unless we help them. China's not going to go green. Even though China is going green, they're still heavily based around coal, oil, natural gas, all that. They're building renewables. But they aren't building them, super fast at rocket speed to go like, oh shit. No. So what I want to say is, yes, the United States can do it. If we can go into Japan and we can go into Germany and pour $20 billion, $15 billion in like 2006 money, I don't know the inflation rate right now. If we can do that and we can make these two countries into proverbial superpowers again, economic powers, hell, what can we do with $20 billion if we gave it solely to Iraq without invading them and toppling their entire government structure and basically not having any allies in the area at all to help us? What can we do to shape their economies into a way that makes sure that our entire world doesn't burn and my children, your great-grandchildren can enjoy the world and they can go to a Dodgers game and see baseball, not underground in a shelter full of air conditioning vents? So guess what? The United States can definitely do it. We have enough money. We've done it before in subsidizing build-ups of economies. We've done it after occupying them with political and economic ventures. And when people bring up Iraq, remember, we invaded Iraq. But what can we do with renewable energy subsidies towards these countries if we don't invade them? That's all I'm going to say. It's going to be the video. Thank you for watching. Long tangent, but hey, hope you have a great day.